Let's get going. Thank you so much for coming today. This is the first of a series of webinars that Verifinance is going to be holding this year, really focusing on the consumer duty and all the elements of it. It's an incredibly exciting piece of regulation that we see is already having a big impact, and we think it's just the beginning. But of course, it does provide a lot of challenge for organisations. And we're going to be focusing today particularly on the consumer understanding outcome and specifically how to write, design and test clear and simple communications. We're excited. We've had over 500 people register for today's webinar, so it's obviously a topic that lots of people are still continuing to wrestle with. And so hopefully what we can give you to take away from today's webinar is some useful information, some actionable tips that you can use to simplify your documents, and some context around some of the best ways to go about rewriting, redesigning technical documents, as well as how to test them and ensure that you're meeting all of the requirements of the FCA's consumer duty, and as I say, specifically the consumer understanding outcome. Now, if you're here today, you probably know who we are, and that's great, but I will just give you a very quick introduction in case you don't know everything that we do. Verifinance is 10 years old. In fact, 28th of February next month will be the 10th anniversary of our incorporation as a business. We are a research and ratings and consultancy company, and we also do some policy and advocacy work. But everything we do is guided by our mission to create a fairer financial services market for consumers, as well as the businesses that serve them. And of course, that bit's really crucial. We can't have a fair market for consumers if it isn't also fair for industry. And our starting point 10 years ago was creating ratings to help consumers make more informed decisions when they're shopping for financial services products, particularly in the context of an increasing number of consumers having to buy financial services products direct or through comparison sites without any support from a broker or financial advisor. And so essentially we published two types of ratings. The first ones that we started with 10 years ago are called our customer experience ratings, and these are a combination of customer polling that we do to 10,000 people every 6 months, ombudsman data, specifically the uphold rate at the Financial Ombudsman Service, and then finally what we call our transparency analysis, which is an analysis of the clarity of information that firms give to their customers when they're applying for products online, but then also an analysis of the clarity of the policy document or terms and conditions. And all of this seemed like quite a niche pursuit, I think, to a lot of firms for the first sort of 8 years or so, but it's had a whole new relevance in the context of consumer duty. For our sins, for the last 10 years, we spent quite a lot of time looking at the reading age of policy documents and terms and conditions, counting the words in them, assessing their reading ages, and all of that has led to the development of our consultancy propositions, where we work with firms to support them rewriting and redesigning their terms and conditions and policy documents, as well as shorter form communications like letters and emails. And so all of that experience and knowledge that we have working with firms across the banking, insurance and asset management sectors over the last 10 years, we're going to be sharing with you today. And the presentation that we're going to be sharing will be made available for you afterwards as well, so that you can download it and share it with colleagues internally. And there'll also be a recording of this webinar as well, which you can download and share with colleagues too. So that's a brief overview of who we are, and as well as helping firms rewrite and redesign their terms and conditions and test them, which we'll also be talking about today. Over the last couple of years, we've increasingly been working with firms to help them get ready for consumer duty and make sure that they're meeting the requirements and that they understand how they're doing. You know, as you all know, you have to attest at board level that you're working to deliver good customer outcomes, and that you can prove that your customers understand your communications, that you've got the right governance processes in place to ensure that you're delivering appropriate products to the correct target market. And of course, you've also got to prove that you're delivering fair value. And these, as I say, are all challenges that firms are continuing to wrestle with today, even though Consumer Duty has been with us now for 6 months as of tomorrow. We are going to be doing, as I say, a series of these webinars across 2024. So today's one is about the consumer understanding outcome, but the next one, the date's still to be decided, but it's going to be in the spring, either towards the end of March or sometime in April. We'll be looking at fair value and how to test and assess fair value. And later on in the year, we'll be moving on to look at some of the other outcomes as well. But if there are other areas that you're particularly interested in, areas you're struggling with, please do get in touch with us, and we're open to suggestions. And we're also hoping to be launching a podcast this year. So if you prefer to digest some of this information while you're walking the dog, then hopefully we'll be serving up something for you to consume there as well. There will be a chance for people to ask questions today and to try and interact with us, although it'll be in the chat of the webinar. So the Q&A function isn't working, but you will find that if you want to leave questions, you should be able to drop them into the chat. But for the first half an hour, you're going to be hearing mostly from us. In a moment, you're going to have a presentation from my colleague Eve, letting you know some of the key principles that sit behind all of the work that we do around helping firms rewrite and redesign documents. And then Eve's going to be chairing a discussion with my colleague Tim and myself, and we're going to be talking firstly about customer testing, and then really opening it up to the floor for everyone here to ask any questions that they've got, any specific challenges that you're finding with the work that you're undertaking already, anything that you don't feel has been clear enough in the presentation, a chance to get some extra clarity there. Just a brief introduction of my colleagues. Tim joined us around 5 months ago from the economics consultancy Auxera. He's a director at Fairer Finance and has a background as a behavioural scientist. He's been working with financial services firms for almost a decade and is a specialist in fair value and consumer duty. And in his spare time, he is also an ultimate Frisbee enthusiast, and I'm sure those skills are going to come in very handy in today's webinar. Eve is a manager in our consultancy team, so she also has lots of experience working on consumer duty projects as well as rewriting firms' terms and conditions and letters and so forth. She's been with us 3 years, and fun fact about Eve is that she lived in Siberia for 5 months during her degree, which sounds like one hell of an experience. And feel free to put your questions in the chat about that as well. I'm sure she'll be delighted to answer them. Right, so with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Eve, who's going to talk you through a few slides around how to create clear and simple communications. So Eve, over to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you for that introduction. So yeah, as James said, I'm going to take us through some tips and tricks for writing and designing clearly and simply. But first, let's have a think about why is this important. So the first thing to say is that the Consumer Duty has raised the bar for clear communication in financial services. So firms must now be able to prove that their communications produce better outcomes for customers. And we'll talk a bit later on in our discussion about how best to go about gathering that evidence. But the Consumer Duty is principles-based, so the FCA purposely wants firms to engage with the regulation and not just view it as a tick box exercise. The Consumer Duty does build on previous regulation that we've seen in financial services, such as the Consumer Rights Act, And the Consumer Rights Act said that contracts must be transparent, they must be written in plain and intelligible language. So that begs the question, really, what is plain and intelligible? Well, at Fairer Finance, we believe that most financial services documents can be written clearly and simply. One useful angle we can use when thinking about this is what we know about behavioural science. So our decisions are affected by our cognitive limitations. And the word limitations can sound a little bit harsh, but actually it just speaks to the fact that we don't have brains the size of small planets. So we need to ration our mental effort, our decision making carefully. And we do use different ways and different tools of doing this. So we use things like emotional responses and rules of thumb that draw on the information we have. So our decisions do always depend on the way choices are framed to us. And in behavioural science, this is known as the choice architecture. One of the key implications of behavioural science is that there is no such thing as a neutral choice architecture or a neutral design. And some firms we've worked with have said, you know, we've designed our website to be completely neutral. Well, actually, you know, there is no such thing, unfortunately. No matter how you present information to your customers, you are going to influence the decisions that they make. So given what we know about the choice architecture, we're now going to take a look at our practical advice for writing and designing effective customer communications and ones that generate good outcomes for your customers. So we look at three core areas when we assess this. We look at language, structure, and design. So when we think about language, we're writing in a way consumers will understand, and that's relevant across all different mediums. So long documents, shorter documents, and also online journeys, which we'll talk about a bit later on. For structure, we might have a slightly different approach for a shorter document than we would for a longer document. And it's important to think about effective contents page, effective signposting of information. Design can, of course, aid both language and structure in making your document much more accessible and engaging to read. So using colours to colour code sections, we'll talk a bit more about effective design tools later on. Firms that meet our requirements will be eligible for our Clear and Simple accreditation as well, firms that excel in these three areas. And today we're happy to say that around 25 firms do actually have our accreditation for their documents. So let's dive in first with language, looking at readability. There are lots of stats out there around reading ages, and one that clients we've worked with will have heard us quote before a lot is from the National Literacy Trust. They say that 1 in 6 adults in England has a reading age expected of an 11-year-old. And so when we rewrite documents, we do aim to get the reading age down to at least 11. One thing to bear in mind, though, is that this is a blunt instrument. Okay, it's not a perfect tool, and it should be used as a guide rather than an absolute. What it does is it essentially measures average sentence length and average word length. And you can use tools like Word, which will give you a Flesch-Kincaid score, or apps like Grammarly that will check your syntax and check how your documents are constructed to help you. But what it really boils down to is if you want to lower your reading age, you need to focus on getting shorter sentences, ideally around 20 words on average and never longer than 30 words. So looking at the words you use then, jargon is a really important aspect to consider when we're thinking about language. We know that jargon reduces customer understanding. So where you can, we recommend that you remove jargon terms that readers aren't likely to understand and use simpler terms in their place, because that will help you to bring down the reading grade. We do have jargon checking software on our Insight portal that firms can access, and this will spit out the worst offending jargon terms in your document. So you can start to see where you might be using problematic language. We do think about jargon in 3 distinct buckets: legal jargon, industry jargon, and then common jargon. So with common jargon, we're talking here about unnecessarily formal language, words like using prior instead of before, or using purchase where you could say buy, or using commence, where you might as well just say start. So words that have a much simpler and often shorter replacement that has the same meaning. Then we think about legal jargon. So these are very kind of archaic, legalistic words like hereunder and forthwith, things that we would never really use in a conversation if we were talking to a friend, and that we think don't have any place in customer-facing documents. And then we come to industry jargon, which is often where we kind of meet the most problems and kind of contentious points with clients we work with, where those words may have a specific meaning that relates to the context of your document, and you can't simply put in an alternative. In these cases, we advocate for a simple language explanation, providing that next to that jargon term. And generally, simpler words are also shorter words, so you will be bringing down the reading age of the document as well. One angle you can use to think about this is viewing your document from the outside in. So thinking, what would an outsider to the product find difficult, not understand? What terms might be confusing for them? So imagine, you're always looking from the outside into your product. Think about what terms might be difficult. Would terms you're using be understood by your grandparent? Would they be understood by your child? If the answer is no, then perhaps you need to think again. We do have a few examples here. So like we said, where you can, you should remove jargon terms that readers aren't likely to understand. Many firms use things like glossaries or tooltips on their websites to explain complex language, which is definitely a really good place to start. But a word of warning here, be careful not to define jargon with more jargon. So in the top example here from Nationwide, they've explained AER using the word compounded, and we think there's a high likelihood that a lot of customers won't understand that term compounded. So just consider what language you're actually using to explain the jargon. Like we said, sometimes it's not possible to remove jargon, and instead you might need to elaborate with some examples, and that can really bring kind of complex concepts to life for the reader. So here you can see how First Direct have used multiple real-life scenarios to show the impact of 2 different deposits. One point to note here is that a lot of customers may find percentages overwhelming. They may not understand, for example, here the 7% AER figure, but the examples they've used in pounds and pence instead kind of provide another angle, another way of understanding what this scenario is and how it might affect them. Another thing we do see a lot of in longer documents is firms using things like footnotes or asterisks to explain or add more detail. And often these aren't particularly clear. They can almost be as bad as no explanation at all, unfortunately. Here we have kind of quite a lot of information added with this asterisk, another 2 whole paragraphs. It's a bit of an information overload, and the language used here does use some kind of longer sentences and unclear words. Another aspect to consider is the emotional response you get from your customers when they look at your document. So we know that certain jargon terms might produce kind of negative emotional reactions. So things like anxiety, stress, feeling overwhelmed, feeling confused, and often, experiencing those feelings, customers are likely to put your document down and not carry on reading. So these aren't emotional responses we want to trigger in our customers. Moving on now to think about structure and how to effectively lay out your documents, both longer documents as well as shorter documents. You need to make sure that headings are intuitive and that hierarchy and contents pages are working well to help your customer find the information they're after. Remember that behavioural science tells us that we have limited cognitive resources to rely on here. So most people will not be sitting down to read your communications from start to finish. So the importance of kind of a very clearly laid out contents page is really key here. The first fight is to get your customers' attention and ensure that you've landed your key messages or drawn them in and encouraged them to read more. Taking a look at shorter form documents now. So here's an example letter. Here, really the key is that the key message has to be conveyed in the heading so the customer knows immediately what the letter is about. Remember, you're battling to get the customer's attention. I'm sure, we all receive dozens of communications a day, whether that's through the post or in our email inboxes. So using subheadings and headings to effectively divide up the information makes it much more accessible. It's my view that the customer should almost be able to understand the letter and know what action they need to take from the letter by reading the headings alone. I think often people will probably only read the headings alone, so really think about what information you're conveying through the headings. We've also used this side panel here to the right to separate out information, putting things like contact details and key payment information here. And you should also think about layering your information, so providing one key message up front and then giving the customer different jumping off points to further information that they might need. So this example shows a customer portal, but you might also provide a brochure or a link to the website where customers can access more information. Design elements are really useful and can kind of build on what we've talked about in language and structure as well. So breaking up information, using visual tools to help get information across to customers is really useful. Make sure you use large enough font sizes, enough line spacing, tables, images, infographics as well to make the document easier to read and understand. I think we can all agree that colourful documents are much more engaging, so hopefully here it's pretty obvious which is the good practice document and which, could be improved. We do recommend using at least 3 colours in your documents, and that's including black and white as well, so it's not a super high bar. But do be careful what colours you use. So if there's not enough contrast between the text and the background colour, it can be pretty impossible for some customers to read that information, people with visual impairments or dyslexia. This can be really difficult. I think we've had situations where some firms have wanted to use their brand colours in documents. One client, for example, had brand colours of purple and orange, which did cause some colour contrast issues. But we do usually find a way around it. So you can use other colours within your brand palette, or just be really mindful about what text goes in front of what background colour. A final point on colour, you can use it alongside structure to break up the document and colour code different sections so customers can see which information is relevant to them. Finally, then, thinking about layering communications, we mentioned a little bit earlier, but coming back to this now, as well as thinking about the clarity of your language and the simplicity of the design, it's really important to think about when you land key pieces of information and what formats you're using. So we're going to talk a bit about application journeys in 1 minute, but building on what we've just spoken about in longer documents and shorter documents, you need to think about what the right media is and use it at the right time. So, for example, if someone is renewing their insurance, you might start with a letter and an email. If they've still not taken action a few weeks before renewal, you might think it's time to follow up with a text, and then continue sending a text or another email a week before renewal. And then you might even feel that you need to follow that up with some more text messages in that final week. So we've spoken a bit about priority and order of information in longer documents and printed documents, but now thinking about online journeys, so the priority and the order of the information there is equally important. We read differently when we're reading information online, and studies have shown that we're most likely to use an F-shaped or an E-shaped pattern as our eyes scan information on a web page. So this means that information at the top left of the web page, in that top left corner, and down the left-hand side is where our eyes naturally focus, and information in the bottom right corner is usually most obscure. You can see quite an effective example here from Coventry Building Society. They've used an F-shaped pattern here. They give names of each account down the left-hand side, and then they give more detail in these kind of landscape boxes that go across the page. And I think you'll agree it's quite a nice uncluttered page. It's clear to see which information belongs to which account. It's particularly important to think about priority during application journeys. Again, this might be your one chance to get information across to your customer. So it's really important you use it effectively. In this example, important information relating to fees and charges has been hidden, and it could be easily missed. It's placed below that blue Choose Simple button, so the application button. And the choice architecture here is very influential. So the prioritization of that Choose Simple button means that customers might be less likely to read on and understand that information about fees and charges that sits below that button. Footnotes should be used sparingly. So one thing we do see quite a lot of is firms using footnotes and asterisks on their web pages, as well as within their documents. And we do see in some cases important conditions, fees and charges, things like that hidden in footnotes. So just a note to say that separating out information like this can often be confusing. Something the FCA has spoken a lot about is friction and setting the right level of friction. So in an online setting, we know that small tweaks, small adjustments to websites and apps can actually have large impacts on customers, given what we know about how our attention span works with online environments. So it's really helpful to think about the level of friction in your online choice architecture. So more friction to choose a particular option. And when we're talking about more friction, we're thinking things like extra screens, making the customer scroll down a web page or clicking through various screens. These things are all going to reduce the likelihood that the customer chooses that option. So firms really need to consider, does your choice architecture have low enough friction to encourage decisions that lead to good outcomes? And do you have high enough friction to discourage decisions that lead to poor outcomes? Firms also use interactive tools like these sliders. They're usually used where you have a calculator on your web page. And it's important that you consider what the default setting is here and what outcome that could lead to customers, whether that's leading to a positive outcome or a negative outcome. So that does conclude our presentation. I'm going to hand back over to James now, who's going to wrap up for us before we get into our discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Eve. Hopefully you all found that interesting. And I know a number of people have already asked whether or not this will be available afterwards. And we will, as long as you signed up for the webinar today, we've got your details. We'll be able to let you know how to get a copy of this presentation afterwards. And if you've got any problems, obviously do get in touch with us directly. Our kind of generic email is corporate@fairerfinance.com. So you can always drop us an email there. And we'll also be making this webinar available for you to share with colleagues as well. I'm not going to run through the next couple of slides here because they are basically a summary of what we've already talked about. But when you share this presentation or download it to share with colleagues, then hopefully that'll be useful. And then one final thing to say is if you're looking for a kind of another format where you can get a lot of the detail that we talked about today, around a year ago, we partnered with the ABI to create a sort of practical guide for their members around how to create clear communications. And you can download that for free from the ABI website. And for those of you who are building societies, we also did a similar guide for the Building Societies Association, which you can get from your membership body. And we're working with another industry right now, but I'm not sure if I can tell you that one yet. But we do publish all of this stuff and we make it freely available. So if you want to get hold of any of this, please do get in contact with us if you can't find it. Right, okay, we're going to move on into the next section. Eve is going to chair a short discussion with me and Tim around customer testing. And please do put your questions into the chat because we'll start off talking about testing, but then as some questions come in, we'll start to try and answer those in sort of the last 20 minutes of today's session. I can see we've already had a few and a very efficient audience, with some of the audience members already going in to answer the questions of other audience members. So maybe the chat will serve itself there. But if anybody has got any questions about specific problems they're coming up against, or anything that we haven't covered so far or don't cover in the next section about testing, do feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. But let me hand back to Eve, and let's talk about consumer testing.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so maybe we can just start off by really digging into what the FCA actually means by the need for firms to test their communications. Can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, so I think ultimately what the FCA wants here is for firms to be able to prove that they're delivering good customer outcomes. And this whole burden of proof is at the core of consumer duty broadly. It's not just about the old days of clear, you have to have clear, fair and not misleading documents, and we'll leave it up to you to decide whether it's clear, fair or not misleading. They are saying, actually, you need to prove it. And when it comes to documents, you need to prove that your customers can understand it. And in the initial guidance, they talk specifically about the expectation that firms will test their documents with consumers. So there is going to need to be a bit of that, but I think that we've seen firms get a bit carried away with it because, as many of you may already be finding out, testing physical documents can be tricky because you're not able to do that in a real life environment unless you're hiding in somebody's hallway waiting to see what they do and the letter drops through. And so there are times when testing is great and effective, but there are others when it isn't. And so, I think what the FCA really wants is for you to be able to prove that your communications are delivering good outcomes. And that is first and foremost and the most important thing. So if your letter is written in a language that 99% of people can't make head nor tail of, but all of your MI shows that everybody is doing exactly what they should be doing when they get that communication, then you're in a reasonably good space. Of course, you should try and make your language much easier to read and shouldn't leave the document written really terribly. But don't lose the wood from the trees here. There's no prizes for having a letter that is in perfect language, perfectly designed, but actually nobody's taking any action off the back of it, or they're taking the wrong action. So focus on the outcomes. I think that, and I do think that we will see the FCA come back with some more guidance over the next few months to just clarify exactly what they mean by that requirement to do some testing.
Thank you, James. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, the focus on outcomes rather than actual customer testing. But I'm interested, Tim, in your thoughts. So what are the most effective ways if firms do want to test their communications on customers?
So I think it's fair to say I'm probably slightly more a fan of consumer testing than James, and maybe we'll get into this in the next few minutes. But I think the gold standard for testing is testing the impact on customer behavior and decisions. And that means testing in the real world on real customers through A/B testing in an online environment, or very similar methods in an offline environment. So if in an offline environment, you might have two versions of a renewal letter. You want to see what the impact is on who renews, who calls up, that sort of thing. Well, you can test. You can send one version to one group of customers and another version to another group of customers and just see what happens. Look at the data in a few months' time, see which was most effective, and then go from there. In an online environment, there's a little bit more data, a little bit more richness to it. So as someone goes through a customer journey, you can see where their mouse hovers, how many clicks it takes, how long they spend on certain screens. That's a little bit more of an indication of whether people are understanding what's going on. If they're going back and forward a lot of times, then maybe they haven't quite got something. So in an online environment, A/B testing, leads to much richer and much quicker data on which communications are more effective.
And what about testing customer comprehension? How would you go about doing that?
So this tends to be sort of a different form of primary research. So we tend to think about qualitative and quantitative testing slightly differently. On the quantitative side, it might be a bit more of an online poll. So we might give several hundred or even thousands of customers, different versions of the document. And then we ask for their opinions on that, and we give them comprehension questions, questions with a right answer and a wrong answer based on the document. And we see how well they recall that information and see how well they comprehend it. That gives really good large sample data, which means we can dive into different customer groups and get statistically robust results. On the other hand, sometimes we want to run qualitative primary research, which is where focus groups or structured interviews, small samples of people really diving into the emotional state when someone is looking at a document and how they feel about it, and that of course influences their understanding. So depending on the communication and what we know about the customers, we might do quantitative or qualitative. There's sort of a halfway house as well between this sort of method and an A/B test, which is a behavioral experiment in a controlled online environment. So I absolutely love these. I've recently been doing one on risk warnings in investment. It's where we want to test the impact on behavior. We want to test the comprehension, but we don't want to do it in the real world just yet because we're not entirely sure whether it's going to lead to good outcomes or bad outcomes. So you put people in sort of a hypothetical environment, a few thousand people online, ask them to behave as if it was the real world, and then see whether they behave differently depending on the different risk warning in this example.
And I'm interested to hear from James, because I know you have been skeptical about these forms of testing. What value do you think they have, or what do you think is a better option?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think obviously the limitation, as Tim has said, is that it's an artificial environment. These are not real customers making decisions in real time. If you are testing letters, as I say, you can't be hiding in their hallways. You can't see how long it is until they open the letter, if they open it at all. And so, it's quite difficult to get a very realistic view of how customers will interact with different communications just from focus groups and online tests. However, we've done a lot of these over the last year, and I can see that I do think there is value in helping you see where things really aren't working, where things really aren't clear. Tim was talking about something we did quite recently with a client that was making some changes to its pricing and wanted to test whether customers would understand the messages they were putting across. And actually, their initial attempt showed that customers really struggled. And all those weren't real customers. It was a smart group of people who came in, ready to participate in a focus group and help that firm see that there were a few areas where there were weaknesses and perhaps needed to sharpen things up. So I think they can be useful for highlighting areas that need attention. Where they're not so useful, is for giving you reassurance that customers really are going to understand them. For that, you need to be pairing that up with that evidence that customers are taking the right actions once those communications are being received.
I think, some people might be sitting here, and I can see from some of the questions saying, well, the FCA talks about the need for consumer testing. Do those approaches go far enough?
Well, I think that this is all going to evolve. And I think my reading of the Consumer Duty and the whole kind of creation of it is that partly the FCA sort of brought it to the table, not exactly knowing where it would go and what it might look like in due course. So there was an element of, here's the broad picture, here's the broad principles that we want you to adhere to. But in terms of exactly how you go about that, we're not going to tell you because we're not really sure at this stage. We want you to go out there, all have a think about it, and then we'll take a look at what's going on in the market and start to sharpen our advice as we start to see all the different approaches that people are taking. So, I think it's perfect. One reasonable way to show that your documents are clear for customers to understand, I think, is getting them accredited with, we've got our mark, the Clear and Simple mark. There's the Plain English campaign, there's others out there. That is showing that from a language perspective, at least, you're using language that's more likely to be understood even by people with lower levels of literacy. And then you might do a little bit of targeted testing for certain communications, but there's no escaping having the MI around the outcomes that you're delivering. And that is always going to be where we end back up with Consumer Duty. Are you delivering the good outcomes? That's what this is all about ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we can broaden out a bit then. I'm sure we'll have some more questions about testing later on. But I want to start by coming back to you, James. What do you think the impact of the consumer duty has been on communications, and what areas have firms kind of been struggling with?
Yeah, I mean, it's creating an enormous volume of work. We're seeing that, particularly in large firms where they have got hundreds or potentially thousands of communications they're sending out to their customers. And a lot of them have sort of been struggling under the weight of what they need to do. I think a lot of firms have known for a very long time that their communications are not brilliant, but they sort of look over their shoulder and thought, well, everyone else is in the same boat. And now the FCA has said that's not good enough. You've got to attest at board level that your customers can understand your documents. And so there's an awful lot of work going on at the moment. Most firms have now finished a prioritization exercise. They've prioritized documents into those that are likely to have the sort of highest impact and the highest risk of delivering bad outcomes if they're not clear. And they're going through the process of writing those. Those are generally letters and emails. We've seen firms adding text message capability where they didn't have it before and sending thousands of new messages. And then we are also seeing firms rewrite their terms and conditions and policy documents, but a lot of that isn't so evident in the market yet because those projects, I mean, we know from experience, and we're engaged in a lot of them at the moment ourselves, they tend to take months to do. They're big projects, and I think across 2024 and beyond, we will start to see more and more firms publishing much clearer, much simpler versions of their terms and conditions. So we haven't started down that road yet. It's certainly something you need to have on a roadmap for 2024 and beyond.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that comes up in our conversations with clients is that, particularly with rewriting T's and C's, often there are roadblocks there. So these are legal contracts. And often the people we work with think, well, isn't there a limit to how far we can simplify these documents? So Tim, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think, is there a limit to how far T's and C's can be simplified?
I think you'd be surprised how much legalese isn't actually required. I think that a lot of comfort at the moment comes from the fact that some of the legal language and the jargon has been used for a number of years. It's sort of industry standard. But actually, when we rewrite documents and we start from scratch, we start from a blank page and then go from there. A lot of it isn't actually required. And ultimately, using legalese isn't actually much of a protection in front of the FOS, because if there's ambiguity, then the FOS are quite likely to interpret it in favour of the customer. So it's really got to be nice and clear. And lots of the jargon that you think is industry standard or has to be used, actually, there are simpler versions around it, and we sort of really condense it until really we are left with only very specific terms that have to be used. Some of the jargon, is slightly amusing at times. We had one recently where we're talking about home insurance cover for the contents of a freezer. The original T's and C's used the word provisions. We thought, well, there's probably a word that better describes what's in your freezer. So the legal department came back and suggested foodstuffs. Eventually, we agreed on frozen food. So this is the sort of process that we go through, and it's very collaborative. And there's usually a way through that communicates what, in this case, an underwriter is meaning in a way that a customer will actually understand it without having to think too hard.
Great. And now we're going to switch to some questions that have been left in the chat. And actually, off the back of that one, James, I'd like to come to you. So how can we actually get customers to read communication? So someone's asked, although we're making positive changes to our comms, we still know that large proportions of customers don't read them. How can we change customers' mindsets on this?
Yeah, look, this is it's a great question, and I think actually it drives to a broader point around consumer duty. I think that there's a bit of kind of gossip and prevailing sort of wisdom in financial services that what consumer duty has finally done is remove all responsibility from consumers and put it entirely in the laps of the firms themselves, and I don't think that's the case. What consumer duty is saying is you need to show that you have done what you reasonably can to ensure your customer makes a good decision. Now, if you're sending them a letter, let's talk about renewal on insurance. You send them a letter 1 month before, and then you don't do anything else and just say it's going to automatically renew, and if we don't hear from you, that's it. That's not enough. But if you're sending them a letter a month before, and at the same time you're sending them an email, and then if you haven't had any response from them, perhaps you follow up with another email 2 weeks before and an SMS message, and then if you haven't heard from them with a few days to go, another email, another SMS message. And you've tried multiple times. If they've logged into the portal in any way, you popped up another message for them. You can show that you're doing everything you can to get them to engage with your communications. At that point, then the responsibility does shift to the customer if they're continuing to ignore multiple communications. Obviously, people, I think I saw something in the questions about, what's the point in rewriting T's and C's because nobody reads them. It isn't your responsibility to get people to read the T's and C's. It's not even, a reasonable ask. These are complicated products, and then the T's and C's often run to tens of thousands of words. But the T's and C's are a manual. They're there for when the customer has got a query, and that may be something they want to look at before they buy a product, but more likely it'll be after they've bought it, and they should be able to turn to it, find the information that they need, and when they find it, it's written in a language they can understand, and they can get what they need and leave. So it's just ensuring that you've made your product as accessible as it can be. You've communicated as clearly as you can be. You've thought about all the different ways that customers engage with communications, and you've tried to come at them in different media. And at that point, you can reasonably say we've done what we can do, and you can't force them to read. And then you're in a great place.
And the hope is, I suppose, that these communications will have good outcomes for customers. But what are we actually talking about when we talk about good outcomes? Tim, maybe you could touch on this. So are we talking less complaints, higher customer satisfaction?
So for each product, each firm should have defined what outcomes it's intending to generate. So why does the product exist? What's it there to do? What are you trying to do for the customer? Is it to insure them against something breaking or a flood on their house? Is it to provide them with credit for secured lending or unsecured lending? And what's the purpose of that? Is it so they can buy a home and then not end up in arrears, that sort of thing? So there should be a very specific purpose behind every product. And then some of the other data, the MI, like complaints and that sort of thing, will sort of feed into that and will flag where good outcomes are not being delivered. But that is the sort of the general thinking behind what is a good outcome. One thing that we often bang on about here at Fairer Finance is analysing who your most profitable customers are. So it's a really good thing for firms to know where the profitability is being generated and why, and that's part of the outcomes piece. So who are your most profitable 10% of customers, and why are they that profitable? Is it their behaviour? Is it some innate characteristic about them? Is it what they've bought? Is it the way they're using the product? And from a fair value perspective, you want to be sure that they're getting good outcomes. But from a customer understanding perspective, you want to be really sure that they really understand and really grasp the nature of the outcomes they're getting and the nature of the product. If you can show consumer understanding and comprehension on your most profitable customers, that's a really good first start, because the other customers are probably going to have less challenging things to understand.
And just to kind of bring back in testing a little bit, I think it fits quite nicely into this conversation about good customer outcomes. How can you benchmark success in online testing? So quantitative testing of things like letters and emails. Tim, maybe you can start with that one.
Yeah, so I think when you've done a few of these, you can benchmark internally, and you can sort of compare for your particular target market and customers what's working, what's not working, and that's really useful. When you're starting out, there are industry-wide benchmarks. If you approach an external provider, such as Fairer Finance to help, then we have benchmarks because we've done a lot of this stuff. And there's also quite a lot of publicly available academic research out there. So for example, if you're looking at the responses to renewal letters, there's quite a few papers out there on the subject, not least from the FCA. So it's not actually that hard to get benchmarks, this sort of thing. I'd encourage you to, crack on and then see how it compares.
Great, thank you. One thing I'm personally interested in is using different types of technology and how that can help us improve our communication. So James, I'd like your thoughts on using less written communications and more things like videos, tutorials, things that customers can interact with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we're going to see more of. I think we've touched on it a little bit earlier when you talked in your presentation about the need for positive friction. I think one of the problems that we have in a lot of financial services journeys these days is that the firm knows the customer doesn't want to be there. They just want to get this purchase done and get out the other end. They want them to get out the other end, so they've secured the sale. And so the focus is on keeping the journey as frictionless as possible and getting the customer from the beginning to the end as quickly as possible. But of course, application journeys are one of the only times when you have the customer's attention, and although they may not want to be there, you can't waste that opportunity. One thing that I've been advocating, I think for probably 10 years, for as long as Fair Finance has been going, is a use of compulsory video at the end of the application journey, because at that point you're not going to affect attrition. The person has already clicked buy, so they're not going to quit your journey. Your sale is secured, and you can say, while we process your details, here's a 60-second video, and you could just tell people the 3 things that they know, or rather that are most commonly misunderstood about your product. And I think, yes, video in email communications can be a way of engaging with people, or videos when people log into their apps. So I think we can be thinking much harder. SMS is, it feels a bit 1999 rather than 2024, but SMS is an effective way of communicating with people, and actually a lot of firms still don't have the capability to send SMS. So and of course the other really important thing to say is that the way we engage with communication is always evolving, and so you have to always be thinking what new technologies are there, what are the ways that people engage with communication from service providers today, and how is that changing. Don't just think about other financial services providers, think about how you consume information from everybody all the time. Have you stopped reading your SMSs because they're becoming a bit spammy now? Well, in that case, we're going to have to move away from that to the next channel, whatever that might be.
And yeah, I think building on that, it wouldn't be a 2024 webinar if we didn't talk about AI. So I'm interested, Tim, in your thoughts on firms using tools like AI to rewrite customer-facing documents, for example.
Yeah, I think we already are starting to use AI tools at Fair Finance to help us in this sort of thing, and there are some things that AI tools are already fairly good at. There are a couple of limitations to them. So firstly, they're based on what they can find open source on the internet at the moment. And currently, what an AI will find on the internet is an awful lot of T's and C's which are badly designed, an awful lot of customer journeys which have too much or too little friction in them. So they're currently not getting to the cutting edge. However, they might get there in a few years as the industry improves. And then I guess the other thing that AI struggles with is starting with a blank page. So if you were to put in a really complex page of your T's and C's into ChatGPT, it might be able to help you word it in a slightly more friendly way, to be slightly clearer. You would then need to really very carefully review that, of course, but it's going to struggle to restructure and really think like a human at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had some quite kind of fun times playing around with AI, and yeah, some of the results are quite amusing. James, did you want to add anything here?
No, I mean, I think it's going to be part of the future, isn't it? It's getting better. There are already some good tools out there that that can help you assess documents and make suggestions of where you need to make improvements. Yeah, I don't think it's quite there for rewriting yet, and there are sort of copyright issues with ultimately it's kind of plagiarizing other people's stuff at the moment. But yes, I fully expect that we'll be out of a job rewriting people's terms and conditions within 10 years, but hopefully we'll be adding value in terms of sort of helping them understand exactly what's clear and whether they're articulating what they want to cover, what they don't want to cover, and where the limitations are. I mean, I think there's always going to need to be a sort of human lens on whether or not the words are saying exactly what you need it to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we can wrap up with this final comment. So Victoria Smith has come back on your profitable customers question, Tim. So she said, could you argue that the most profitable customers aren't likely to be the most vulnerable? So testing your vulnerable customer base to ensure we're meeting their needs would benefit the majority.
Yeah, I think it's a really good comment. I think I'd start off by saying I know several business models where the most profitable customers are the most vulnerable, so we can't assume it one way or the other. Obviously, vulnerability is multifaceted, and we can't just view vulnerable people as one group. But it's really important to test and make sure those vulnerable people with different types of vulnerability are in the consumer testing panels or focus groups to make sure that their voice is heard, and to make sure that we can communicate with them. Ultimately, a lot of it comes down to communicating with people who are less experienced, less sophisticated with financial services. But behavioral science tells us that we all have cognitive limitations. So even the most sophisticated person on this call who has bought the most financial products is still going to need help with understanding financial products, especially with their limited time budget. So it's about designing for everyone. And the way we like to do that is by designing for the people who are going to struggle the most, and then everyone else will benefit from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And James, maybe one final reflection on tailoring comms for vulnerable customers and how to make communications more accessible.
Yeah, well, I agree with what Tim said, and in the end, we need to tailor them to ensure they can be understood by the widest audience possible, and that is possible. We know it is possible to write T's and C's and technical documents with reading ages of 11 or below, and to eliminate most of the jargon, or if you can't eliminate it, to provide plain English examples. This stuff is challenging, particularly when you've got legal, compliance, marketing, lots of internal stakeholders with differing views, and I think that's where in these projects we find the best way to get something that is great is to get everybody in the room round the table, sort of arguing it out, and then that generally leads to something that's really good at the end of it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both. That was a really interesting discussion. I think that's about all we have time for. So yeah, James, I'll leave it to you to wrap up the session.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks, Eve. Look, I hope everybody found that insightful and interesting. There's so much stuff that we didn't really have time to discuss today. I think I wanted to talk about some of the prescriptive wording that sits in legislation and regulation. There are ways around that. And of course, we just started to touch on how consumer duty can go so much further than its beginnings here. And I think it does start to ask some quite challenging questions of some established business models when we think about where the money is being made. And that's one of the things that we'll be unpacking in our next webinar, which will be on fair value, proving that you're offering fair value, how to go about that. Watch out for a date on that. We'll post it on LinkedIn. We'll post it on our website, but it'll be sometime in the spring. As I said earlier, we will be making the slide deck from today available. We'll be making the recording of this webinar available, and you're welcome to share that with colleagues internally. If you'd like to talk to us about any of your own documents, or just have a chat with us about anything that we discussed today, some questions that you didn't get answered, always happy to hear from you. As I said, our sort of generic inbox is corporate@fairefinance.com, so you can reach us there. But thank you so much for attending. I think at the peak we had something over 350 people here today, so really exciting for us, and we'd love your feedback. But hopefully we'll see you at the next one, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye for now.